Hello, project people. You're listening to the Project Chatter podcast, your trusted source of project experts. I'm your host, Val Matthews, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Dale Fung.
Hello, Val. Hello, listeners. What a great place to be. Another episode, another week, another fantastic guest. I am really looking forward to this one. We're going to get all geeky, and I'm going to be schooled today, I think, Val.
I think I will be too, Dale. Episode 70. Can you believe it? 70
Wow.
episodes, and we have a special guest with us today. Just a reminder to hit that subscribe button too on whichever platform you listen to your good platform or podcast, on. And don't forget our YouTube channel where you can see us live if you prefer that kind of thing. And if you'd like to sponsor us, Project Chatter Podcast, getintouch.com. We would love to hear from our sponsors. In this pod, let's get to it. We are joined by Mr. John Hollmann to talk about infrastructure project cost overruns and how to avoid them. Hi, John. Welcome to the show.
Hi, how you doing? Glad to be on.
And no, it's our pleasure. It's our pleasure. I'm sure we're going to get all geeky today. But before we do, let's learn a little bit about you. Over to you, Dale.
Thank you, Val. So usually this is the segment where I read the bio, but we thought let's switch it up a little bit today because John has an amazing history, and I'd love, John, for you to tell it firsthand and just sort of your origin story, your career to date, your career path, perhaps some of the twists and turns, and sort of how you got to where you are today, if you don't mind.
Yeah, it is a story of twists and turns. I am a mining engineer, and I spent the first 10 years of my career in the coal mines. So I was a ventilation engineer and a mine planning engineer for a couple of coal mining companies in Pennsylvania, underground mining. And then the coal business went kind of bankrupt in the 1980s when the oil price collapsed. And found myself in as a principal mining engineer in nuclear waste disposal. So I was working with Battelle Institute managing the development of an underground repository for salt. And then they canceled that on me while I was living in Amarillo, Texas, where we were going to put the facility. Found myself between jobs. But I had met a number of people in that nuclear project that were involved with estimating, because part of my role was to evaluate the cost of the facility. And they said, John, you seem pretty smart. Why don't you come over to the project side? And I became a project controls engineer / estimator. And just kind of woke up one morning and I was a senior project controls engineer. I had no idea what I was doing. So I was kind of in a panic. I'm in my mid-30s, couple of kids, and had to learn a new career. But I'm a big reader and kind of autodidact and learning things on my own. So I read everything I could get my hands on. So I essentially read the entire AACE library and everything else. And from that, I realized that it didn't make any sense to me. I got very involved in AACE then, and ended up leading the development of the total cost management framework, which was a 10-year effort. It was basically my learning exercise to make sense out of project control. And so that took forever to do that. Meantime, I kept changing jobs. I worked for Fluor, which became Fluor Daniel. Then I went to Kodak, which was really a chemical company and did a lot of process plant type work. Ended up back at Fluor, back to Kodak. Then where did I go then? Then I went to independent project analysis. So I eventually ended up at IPA, and I was responsible for their cost engineering committee, which was a consortia of all of the managers of cost engineering for the large oil and gas and chemical companies. And we would meet and do research and so forth. And I was responsible for their cost and schedule metrics program and also for project controls research. So I was a little different than a normal IPA analyst in that I came out of the business. The consortia wanted someone like myself. I was actually at Kodak, a representative to the committee, and then IPA kind of hired me in to run the committee. And then I left there 15 years ago to consult on my own. And since then, I've been the owner of Validation Estimating, consulting mainly on helping companies improve their project controls practices, their cost engineering, their estimating. And more, though, my career and interest has shifted to the dark side, which is risk. What I learned over the years was companies really didn't need much help with base estimating. That by and large, that was done okay. And it's not really the problem with projects. The base estimate is usually pretty decent. But what I found was that the risk analysis was atrocious. Having been at IPA, having seen, thousands of projects and the problems people had with overruns, the terrible risk analysis that were done, I started to focus on that side of the house. So in the last 5, 10 years even, I've been focused more and more on the risk quantification, where I think the opportunity is to improve. And also, having been at IPA, which has, I think now they have over 20,000 projects in their database, I was very aware of the power of data. And while we weren't at the time using machine learning, we were doing regression. I learned statistics. You kind of have to go back to school at IPA to learn how to use data and do statistics. So even in my 50s, I was still learning that side of the house. And I'm getting older now, and I don't have many more careers ahead of me. But what I'd like to help do now is help bridge into the data-driven world. I am not a computer guru. I'm not an AI expert, but I think I understand real data as well as anybody. And so what I'd like to see happen in industry is bring the data-driven view to the risk equation. And I think the process plant world through IPA and others have been doing that pretty well with the regression-based approach. But infrastructure is lagging by about 15, 20 years in terms of data and benchmarking. And so that's kind of the last barren territory that hasn't been tackled. So infrastructure overruns is the topic today, because that's where my career has taken me, to bring empirical data to what we do, focusing on the risk, and infrastructure particularly tackle this overrun problem, which really has to do with crappy contingency estimates. It's not lying, it's not deception by and large. I've been doing benchmarking individually and with IPA for 25 years. And as Ed Merrow, the owner of IPA, said, you don't need Machiavellian reasons to explain overruns. It's all very fundamental. And while government projects are a little more subject to the politics, and you can get some deception and stuff going on there, it's still just basic practices. And we can get into that as we talk, but yeah, I've got about 40 years varied background, but it is kind of funneled to this risk equation.
No, that is awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. And what a decorated career. I love hearing people's stories because there are, as you say, so many twists and turns. And, people only hear or see a certain portion of that, and perhaps a snapshot in time. So thank you for sharing that. As you mentioned, the topic is infrastructure cost overruns and how to avoid them. And you mentioned sort of your careers led you to infrastructure today, but can what we'll get into in a second or a couple of minutes be applied to non-infrastructure projects as well? Just to set the scene, is what you're going to be talking about generic, or is this only targeted at the infrastructure folks?
Well, the reason I'm focusing on infrastructure is because it's the last untamed territory. The process plant world, I could go into it for hours talking about the history of risk quantification. But one of the founders of AACE in 1958 wrote a paper, article in a magazine about a parametric model for contingency estimating for process plants. And it actually became quite popular and was commonly used in the 1960s. He wrote another book, John Hackney, as a landmark text on the control and management of capital project. And he had the model in there. And so data was a thing back then. Every owner company had a strong database, as well as their contractors, all collected data. And we're trying to build models from that. And it was kind of a nirvana at the time. But then the 1980s came. It's about the time I lost my mining job. But in 1985, At-Risk for Excel came out, which made every estimator in the world a risk expert. And the entire empirical 30-year history preceding that just vanished almost instantaneously. Things kind of went downhill. But the good news is independent project analysis, IPA, kept the Hackney world going. It was kind of like the Irish monasteries preserving civilization back in the Dark Ages. So IPA built their own contingency analysis model, updated it every year as they added more projects. And of course, they had their front-end loading phase gate process, and it was all tied together. And then in the 1990s, Construction Industry Institute did their project definition rating indexes. Behind that was additional quantitative research, and CII also developed models from that data. Of course, nobody paid any attention to the data. Everybody uses FEL, everybody uses PRI, but the data behind it just kind of ignored, But anyway, the process plant world has got it covered for 60 plus years. IPA has been around for 30 years. And these models have been used daily by IPA. Just nobody's really aware of it. It's kind of this secret little sect in the background, still playing with data. Now, the most wonderful thing is AI came up, the last 5-7 years. It's kind of resurrecting. Everybody's like, oh, data, lot of progression. And it's like, I'm ready, guys. We know what we need to do. And so anyway, to get back to your question, the process plant world has been benchmarking for 30 years. They get together here where I live in Ashburn, and all the executives, and put their logos on the board on their cost effectiveness and cost accuracy. And but transportation has nothing like that. There's no benchmarking to speak of. They have no real data. They don't have the history of the Hackney type model. Now there are, pockets of empirical excellence, like the FTA in the US has some empirical based models. There's little pieces of it. But like I said, they're lagging the process plant world by about 15 years, both on the phase gate side. The process world's had phase gates for 30 plus years, but the transport really didn't start implementing their phase gate until about 2000, the last 15 years. So most countries now have phase gate. So that's the first step. Now the second step is to use that to quantify the risk.
Yeah, no.
Transport is the last, like I said, frontier that hasn't been brought up to speed. So process plants, I think, pretty much got it covered. But people in infrastructure don't seem to be aware there is, all of this has happened. Anyway.
No, that's fascinating. I love the insight, and obviously backed up by plenty of data and analysis and research that you've done. I wonder then, okay, so let's get into it. Just one question from me before I hand to Val around infrastructure cost overruns. What is the data telling us that is a main root cause? Is it poor estimating? Is it the contract, nature of the contract? Is it behaviors and culture? We hear a lot of that. Is it just hiring incorrectly, the wrong staff? Is it a host of, a combination of factors? What is the key driver that sees these overruns, just from your view of what you've seen of the data?
Well, the fundamentals of projects are essentially the same in the process plant world as it is in infrastructure. Of course, politics is involved in government-owned projects a little bit more, so there's some bias there. But fundamentally, they're the same that way. The transportation, the big difference is, A, they have lousy contingency estimating, which is true everywhere, actually. But they have this nasty habit, being political, of announcing the project too soon. And I think Marion Terrell in Australia, through the Groton Institute, has brought this up. And it's pretty common knowledge that the politicians will announce a project when the estimate's class 4, class 5, before we really even know what the scope is, which would not be a problem, by the way, if the contingency addressed the level of scope definition. Just remember those words. All we have to do, people, is use the contingency method that gives you enough money to cover the lousy level of scope definition. That's it. So, we can probably end the interview here because it's such a simple one.
Right, but, done, cut.
That's it. So we're in like I said, the phase gate system solved that problem for the for-profit world. We have had phase gate and a fairly disciplined development of the scope along with the estimate now for 30 years. Just about every process company has phase gate since the mid-1990s. So there's a lot of discipline there. So nobody approves any money, announces money until it gets through the phase, the gate. And the risks are better understood. But in the government world, because they did not have phase gate until about the year 2000, they were just announcing willy-nilly, as soon as they wanted to get some political points, they would say, we're going to build this bridge or this highway, and we weren't ready as a profession. The cost engineers and risk analysts, it just wasn't ready. So unfortunately, about 2000, when the phase gate was kicking in, that's when Dr. Flidberg published his first paper on lying misrepresentation in the transport world. Really got it wrong. It's simply a case of they weren't estimating the contingency realistically, and they were announcing it class 4 or even class 5. Now, in the transportation world, they would know what a class 5 was from Adam back then, but that's the problem, really, is the timing of the studies that started coming out of the behavioral scientists was just as the transport world was starting to introduce phase gate and just trying to get some discipline into their process. So all of that's happened in the last since about the year 2000, quite dynamic situation. And now we have this tug of war where we have the behavioral scientists on one hand have created this false message that it's all bias and deception. And we have the practical side, like myself and others, who recognize that, no, it's very fundamental practices that are just really lagging badly in the infrastructure world.
Yeah, that's great. John, I hear all your points there, and there's still the fact that we don't have those maturity steps in infrastructure. And I agree with you. It's the last frontier and how exciting for the rest of us that are in the infrastructure business to bring those I call best practice or recommended practices forward. And there is this kind of shock and awe when they say, oh, when you do bring some of these things forward, John, and they perceive them as new. And when you surprise them even more by saying, these have been around for a while, they're like, oh, okay. But I want to get into this with you. I mean, we did have someone, episode 52, we had Dr. David Hewlett. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with each other. He's also an AACE fellow, and he talked about the 6 maturity levels of risk analysis, which I thought was really, really good. And you're talking about classes. Maybe can you give us a bit more of a description of these classes and why they're important in terms of risk and estimating?
Well, and I do know Dr. Hewlett, and I think that he probably would deny it, but I helped recruit him into the AACE world back in about 2008. We were developing the decision and risk management certification exam, and we needed a scheduling guru or expert to help us with the recommended practices. So David kind of came out of the PMI world and got him into the AACE.
Nice, good work.
House, but so no, we've known each other. We're both co-chairs now of the Decision and Risk Management Committee. We have different views of things, but all of us well-paid consultants get pretty passionate about our method. But anyway, in terms of classification, the most fundamental risk management practice is stage gate or phase gate scope development. That is risk management. It is the only reason for phase gate is to manage the risk, which is basically only approve as much money as commensurate with your knowledge of the scope and your ability to understand the risk. And so we do that in a disciplined way. So phase gate, everything we do starts right there. Now, again, going back to history, in the 1990s, as phase gate became standard in the process industry, a number of us at AACE decided we needed a Rosetta Stone, if you will, of what do estimators need to know about phase gate in order to develop an estimate to align with the decision maker. So we started developing a series of estimate classification recommended practices. And really all that does is say that at class 5, we have to have these deliverables at this level of definition, and that will support an appropriate estimate for the first gate. Then we go to class 4, that's the second gate. So class 4 is when a company narrows down to one option. So class 5, we have multiple live options, and they have a long-term budget. Mm-hmm. That's a whole risk analysis question in its own right of how do you put a range on 5 options. Exactly. But class 4 is actually an extraordinarily important gate because they are deciding on one scope to do the basic, hone in on the engineering. And so that's really the biggest decision. You're not sanctioning the money, but generally speaking, after gate class 4, you rarely cancel. At IPA, we used to call it de facto sanction because, it gets a head of steam going. And this is also when the politicians start announcing project. Even though they haven't got the scope nailed down on, at least they have one kind of option. And then there's class 3, which is the point of full funds sanction. And every industry, class 3 is the level of definition a prudent decision maker can approve the full funds and have reasonable understanding of the risk at that point. And then there's a class 2, which class 2 is very important in the infrastructure world because many of the government agencies require a tender in hand before a true approval of all the funds. So class 2 is when you have the tender from the construction contractor in hand. Gives you a little more, it's not really about accuracy, it's about risk transfer. So all that happens at class 2 is really not more accurate, but all you're doing is transferring the risk to different parties. So the individual parties know who owns what. So from an owner, the class 2 looks more accurate, but really it's simply that you've transferred some of the risk to somebody else to carry. So the owner looks better. The contractor has fairly narrow risk. Anyway, and then class one, really nobody does that except for change orders and things. But so we developed that in the 1990s, and since then we've been developing different versions for different industries. So in 2018, we rolled out the classification for road and rail project, as well as pipe and pipeline transportation, and another one for high voltage power, all of which are part of the infrastructure world. So we now think we have classification for 80% of the capital investment world. Still a few corners and bits and pieces here and there. Like tunnels, we're working on tunnels right now, and a couple of others.
Oh,
anyway,
fantastic.
Question about class?
Yeah, no, I think that helps a lot of people that, again, you know, some of these things are quoted and from the AACE library, but they're also things that you've directly involved in, and it's great to hear firsthand from yourself, John. I also wanted to go back and talk about contingency, because you mentioned this was a big part of this avoiding cost overrun is getting contingency right. What can we do? What's the method to get contingency right out there?
Well, like I said, what happened in 1985 and since then is Monte Carlo simulation became an everyday tool because it attached to a spreadsheet. And so for the longest time, what was happening is estimators simply took their estimate and applied what we call ranging. There's different versions of it, but simply taking estimate items and slapping a high and a low on it, and do some correlation and run Monte Carlo, and called that a risk analysis. The problem is that that only works for one type of risk, and that's what we call inherent risk. It's only the risk that the estimator can see, and the people on the estimating, supporting the estimate in terms of how good is my takeoff? How well did I get quotations and things like that? And do we understand the productivity? That's a very narrow segment of the uncertainty equation. And so, you know, I'm not putting down Monte Carlo, I'm not putting down ranging. It's only that it only works for that narrow set of risks. But what was happening is they were applying it to the entire project. And what happened in ranging was they were sitting around a table, throwing ranges at cost number, and attempting to cover all the risk in the universe, you know, all the risk events, all the inherent uncertainty, all the systemic risk, and we can get into systemic risk in a bit, and it just didn't work. And what it was happening is it was understating the P90, P95, the high end, by a factor of about 2 to 3. We know this. We know exactly how much it's understating. But we couldn't get anybody to pay attention because Monte Carlo is so cool. Man, it's, you know, I can get that risk. I'm not going to pick a crystal ball and plug in numbers and look at this curve comes out, and I can do the P10, the P90. Everybody's so impressed. But ask the question, is it real? So in 2004, when I was at IPA, our cost engineering committee sponsored a study and found out, you know, and the word we used in the study was that the method was a disaster. And generally speaking, IPA doesn't use hyperbole. It was a true disaster, meaning that it was generally a random number generator, had nothing to do with the actual cost growth on projects. It kept predicting the same 7% contingency, which was adequate to cover the inherent risk. And it totally ignored all other risk. So we kept getting 7%, 8%, 7%, 10%, 7, you know, on projects. I can remember mining projects on the top of the Andes Mountains that, you know, the contractor was telling the owner, you know, it was 8% contingency. And it's like, you just kind of shake your head. And so anyway, it's because we lost touch with data. In the 1980s, also coincided with a thing called downsizing and outsourcing. You guys are fairly young, so you weren't there. It was devastating. The owners cut their in-house staff by 50, 70%. All the people involved with historical data, building tools, data went out the door. And then they outsourced all the estimating to contractors who simply didn't pick up the ball. You know, the contractors are really good at bidding class 3, but as far as class 4 and 5, really had no clue. So we were in this kind of terrible situation where there was no data. Owners really didn't know what they were getting. They weren't questioning it, except for IPA. Like I said, it was like the Irish monastery. So, you know, IPA would tell them, no, guys, you know, let's get real. Here's what the data says. But as far as in-house at the owners, they were suffering for a lack of data. It's coming back. It's coming back. But anyway, I'm lost track of where I was going. But did I answer the question?
No, that's okay. No, that's okay. I think we're just trying to understand what was missing. So you mentioned inherent risk. I think just to drill a little bit deeper into that. So there's obviously other types of risks, is there, that we're not capturing, and that's affecting our contingency estimating?
Yeah, so the number one risk, and this is where we need to talk about terminology and some words that people aren't familiar with, but in 2008, when we started developing the AACE certification and all that, the term systemic risk was brought into the lexicon. That comes out of the IPA and the benchmarking world. I use the word systemic because economics has been using it forever, but it matched a systems point of view. And at IPA, we looked at project systems. So IPA benchmarks not only an individual project, but the organizations, how they do projects and their teams and their organization. And also how they interface with the external system, which would be the politicians, the environment, the sustainability, all of that. It's a huge system. And it was pretty well understood that uncertainty, that big cloud of high and low, came not from how the estimator did their work, which is one little tiny narrow segment of the system, but in how the company executed this capital project. Did they have the people to do it? Did they have the maturity, like David Hewlett and his maturity matrix? If you're immature, it's common sense to everybody that you're going to get lousy outcome. You're not going to be predictable, right? So systemic risks are attributes of your system. And if you have weak attributes, you're going to have more uncertainty. That's it. It's very simple. And all of the historical research going back to Hackney was quantifying systemic risk. But that kind of got lost. And one of the most important systemic risks then is the level of scope definition. The reason we call that a systemic risk is because it's your phase gate system, again, the word system, is the process to impose discipline on the phase gate and your estimate, by the way. And so the level of scope definition is risk number one, big bold letters. Thou shalt measure your level of scope definition first and quantify the impact of it. And if you do that, you're about 80% there. But what you'll find on projects is they don't measure it in transportation and they don't quantify it at all. So if you look at a transportation infrastructure project at class 4, there's almost no recognition that the level of scope definition mattered. Now I published a study along with the consortium of US power utilities last year at AACE, and of these 6 major power utilities, these are big companies, guys, you know what contingency they were applying at class 4 was 10%. We looked at the contingencies they were applying, and it was 7% at class 3, 10% roughly at class 4, and 12% at class 5, when they didn't even know what the scope was, for heaven's sake. That's, unfortunately, we think a power utility be keeping up with oil and gas. But unfortunately, they're still in this inherent risk mindset that's just devastating. And I think that's what the behavioral scientists didn't recognize. That, in fact, if you look at the original Flidberg paper, he basically said technical causes can't be the explanation because we're smart people. And if it was a technical cause, we would have fixed it by now. And I had to kind of say, sorry, Dr. Flipberg, but no, we're a bunch of idiots. We recognize it, but we haven't fixed it. And all you're saying is that we are not quantifying systemic risk. Now, beyond the level of scope definition, systemic risk also includes project controls and the maturity, risk management and the maturity of that, complexity of the asset, complexity of your execution strategy. I think, Dale, you mentioned contracting. So you have to have a well-reasoned strategy there. But any of those things are not defined, you're up, let's call it shit creek. And so the transportation industry is really up shit creek in terms of contingency estimating. And the politicians have taken advantage of that. They know if they announce it at class 4, the idiots in the back room are going to give them a low number. And they don't have to lie. They don't have to deceive. They simply have to announce it early, and party time, they've got a project approved because nobody's quantifying the number. So anyway, we know the answer. It's called scope and scope definition and quantifying that explicitly. And that's the answer right there. If we want to stop overrunning, we need to have phase gate, measure the scope development, be disciplined about it, quantify it, end of story, and we've got it covered. Now, people don't believe me, but that's why I wrote my book eventually, is trying to communicate. 300 pages here. The first 150 pages is the research, because I had to get that Irish monastery and get it out into people's hands and explain all this. So anyway, here we are. I'm still explaining it. So.
No, that's okay. I appreciate that. I'll get Dale to jump in now.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. Just for the listeners that won't watch the YouTube necessarily, the book is called Project Risk Quantification. Is that the full title, John?
Yeah, so it's about 5 years old now, but it's available on Kindle for about $10. So no excuse not to get it. It's easy.
And it's way worth more than $10. So listeners, go out and grab yourself a copy there. I was fascinated by just listening to you there, John. And you mentioned a whole host of various topics that sort of, in my mind, I wrote down quite a few questions. But one you brought up quite frequently was around risk and uncertainty. And a little while back, we posted a discussion question on LinkedIn, and there was quite a lot of discourse and debate about what the definitions of uncertainty and risk and the relation between those two are. I wonder if you could just clarify from your own opinion, or your knowledgeable, experienced opinion, what risk and uncertainty actually is for those that perhaps have not really dipped a toe even into risk management, what the definitions are, how they relate to each other, and why there is this confusion out there as to the various relationships of the two components.
Yeah, and I think the takeaway right now you need to know is there is no accepted definition. And so my recommendation to all my clients and everybody is, first of all, when you're having a conversation, define your terms. Because, in AACE TCM framework in the risk management chapter, there are 16 definitions of risk given. The reason we did that was just simply to drive home the fact that if you're in insurance, or if you're in safety, or you're in project, everybody has their own perfectly valid definition. And there's all kinds of things like the night decision, which I don't understand, the very oddball definitions that, so the point is we have to agree amongst ourselves what we're talking about. So, there's a couple of ways you can look at risk versus uncertainty. As engineers and cost people, I direct people to the one we understand the easiest. When we do quantification in our tools, it's fairly simple to think about. Uncertainty, generally speaking, is a fact. It's 100% probability. It's not an event. So uncertainty are just attributes of our system and the way we do things that causes a cloud of, could be here, could be there, we don't know. Some people would say it's unknown, but I don't agree with that. We know exactly what that cloud looks like. But anyways, uncertainties then have a probability of 100%. Systemic risk, for example, I would argue are uncertainty. We call it a risk, and then I get back into the definition. Risk, ISO and AACE and PMI all have the same definition of risk, by the way, which has to do with anything that causes you to deviate from your plan is a risk. Opportunity, threat. So risk has this, and because they defined it so broadly that way, it's almost synonymous with uncertainty. Because it's just anything can go here and there, you know, so that's where we get kind of lost. The risk definition from ISO is basically synonymous with uncertainty because it's not very specific. But from a quantitative viewpoint, uncertainty is 100% probability. Risk is generally an event, or which is a less than 100%. It's something that will happen or occur, yes or no. And so that's the simple way. Then we can get into inherent versus contingent. Same thing, you know, there's almost always a dichotomy. You know, when you look at these, there's a dualism. Whether you call it risk and uncertainty, inherent, contingent, systemic, project specific, there's always the one or the other, right? So, you know, there's that dualism going on. So anyway, risk events are also called contingent risks. Uncertainties are often similar to inherent risk. Some people call them planned and unplanned, you know, which I think is ridiculous. You don't really plan anything till the end, you know, but anyway. So if you want to know the definition, the simplest one is the 100% and less than 100%. Or inherent contingent is probably the one set of terms that most industries use and kind of understand. So I think of risk in terms of quantification. I think of contingent risk, which is the probability less than 100%. And when I think of uncertainty, I think of inherent and just attributes and facts about the state of things that results in that cloud of noise. I think that's the hot topic now in the last week is noise is the big book on the market. I haven't read it yet, but I did read earlier Kahneman article about noise. But anyway, that's a very good way to start learning about it. Noise really has to do with that uncertainty part.
No, that's awesome. Thank you for
on a tangent there. So does that help?
No, it's great. It's great. I love it because the more we can hear from your expertise, I think the better for everyone. Yeah, it's great just to get your view on the two, you know, definitions. And I think the key takeaway there for me, as you said at the top of it, is just ask people, what is your understanding? And so we can talk the same language. Because as you say, it often gets lost in translation. I've had many projects I've worked on where people mention the word baseline. And I say, what do you mean? What do you mean by baseline? Is it your earned value management baseline? Is it your cost baseline? Your schedule baseline? The one in your schedule in your contract? What do you mean? And the range of answers you get is you could write a book about them.
We just had a debate 2 days ago on LinkedIn about inflation versus escalation. Again, same thing. Finance thinks it's inflation. We think it's escalation. Other people won't know what any of them mean.
Yeah, and utilization is another one that
right.
Yeah, but no, it's great. So folks, if there's one takeaway from that little mini conversation there, ask if you're unsure, if you're having a debate, to say, what do you mean? You know, and just agree on what the definitions are.
The one place where it's going to come to a head is the workshop, the register. That's where it all filters down to what is it we're putting in that document. And that's also one of the problems with quantification is that the registers are lousy. So, you know, if you know about the risk management process, the first thing we have to do is identify the risk. Get them out on the table. And usually most people use a register to capture that. And then things kind of go downhill from there because the register attempts to break it down or categorize them. And that's where it just starts falling apart, is that, it's full of all kinds of worries. And then you get the issues definition, another one that just causes nightmares. I don't believe in issues. Get that word out of my lexicon, if you will, please. But anyway, all of these words come in and just confuse the hell out of people. But so yeah, it's a real problem. So when you start that workshop and to start developing your registry, you have to agree on the exact what's going in this document. How are we going to classify things and break them down? What are we going to quantify this way? What are we going to quantify that way? That's another problem, is that you can't use the risk register for quantification. It's totally useless for quantification, and people want to use it, but really it's just a log, just a tracking mechanism. When we get to quantification, we're going to pick and choose things out of that random list to quantify different ways. And that's something else people don't recognize, is there are different methods of contingency development for each type of risk. There is no one method that works well for all of it. So that's another problem people aren't aware of. I'm working on reviewed a paper by a guy named Dr. Peter Love there in Australia. And he talks about having a toolkit. And really that's where AACE is going. We have a number of hybrid methods. So when we talk about that, you have to have a risk contingency toolkit to properly quantify the different classes and phases. And as the risk type changes from phase to phase, you have to have different tools. So that's, that's one of the arguments Dr. Hewlett and I have, is he's very much the critical path method expert, but you don't have a critical path schedule at class 5. What the heck are you going to do? You have to have a method for class 5. And then at class 4, often you still only have a Gantt chart or maybe the very fundamental critical path. You still can't use critical path method at class 4. So again, we have to have a toolkit. And so kind of going off on tangents again here, but anyway, these are all the risk register, the risk types, the toolkit to line up your contingency with the different risk types. All of that is essential. And nobody understands that. I keep saying Monte Carlo method. There is, that's another one, the Monte Carlo method. Please take that. There is no such thing. Monte Carlo is like multiplication. You use it on your checkbook and you use it for your taxes, but there's no multiplication method. The Monte Carlo, you can simulate anything, right? So anyway, you have ranging is being used for everything. All phases, all risk types are trying to range it. It's just total disaster, as we said at IPA.
Yeah. I think it almost occurs to me on projects, big projects in particular, infrastructure projects, that it's more of a box ticking exercise than it is an actual process to, again, have another viewpoint or perception of the project. I always saw, at least in my view, and maybe with Dale as well, it was always just another vantage point to see, okay, the estimates that we have in the program, are they close? But usually what would happen is the effort to estimate was crunched down into such a small period of time, because we were also delivering at the same time as actually trying to estimate the project. This is during the delivery phase, that I was more worried about the quality or the methodology behind the estimates than I was the output of the Monte Carlo simulation. And when I brought this up, it was often quashed or discussed, kind of deferred, or we'll talk about that later. And I feel like a lot of people in projects want to do a good method of estimating and want to use risk, quantification, and definitely some of these Monte Carlo methods, processes, or calculations, as you put it. But I feel like, again, back to data, like you said, and garbage in, garbage out. How do we affect that causation? Because I really feel like it's the start of the process that's the problem, not necessarily the output. What's your view on the inputs?
Well, that's a fact of life that estimating is the tail of the dog. And I'm an estimator. And that's, if somebody asked me what my project expertise is, it was originally estimating. But you're always getting information late and crammed into the final couple of months of the project and just scrambling. And, you know, for contractors, developing a bid is just insanity. You know, the owners, 3 weeks, you know, to develop a, you know, $1 billion, you know, are you insane? You know, so the quality of the product, very hard to maintain in your Scrum. Now the risk is even worse because that is then post estimate and post schedule development. And so if you have 5 days, you know, you're kind of lucky half the time. And that's a fact of life, and we're not going to get around that. So actually, when I developed my toolkit, if you will, and at AACE, my focus has always been on practicality. We have to have rational, practical methods that the average cost engineer estimator can do. And we can't have them be so complex and so statistically, all this arcanity that it's just ridiculous. We have to make tools that people can use. And so that's where I have focused on. So the methodologies in my book, even though there is a toolkit and multiple methods, all of them are eminently doable in a short period of time. So when I do a risk analysis, even for a mega project, it really takes me more than about a week or 10 days, tops, from the time I start talking to the team to having a report. Because if I have a method that takes longer than that, then it's only going to be good for a few mega projects here and there, which, you know, there's a lot of mega projects can make money on, but I want my clients to have a set of tools they can use for a $5 million project just as easily as they can use for 500 million or 5 billion. And so that's, you know, in my book, that is a driving force, is to what methods and tools, or I think what Dr. Love called them as heuristics. I think what Kahneman calls in his book about noise is algorithms. These are all ways of simplifying a very complicated statistical situation into a set of rules and a model, algorithm, heuristic, whatever you want to call it, that can give us reasonably good outcomes that are reliable. And so that's where I've been at, is developing the heuristic, that set of tools with certain rules, empirically informed by reality, that bring data into it, that is reliable. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but
no, that's great. But
there's a rhyme and reason to everything I'm doing for the last 15 years is to that point.
I do take that point on. I think as well, just for the listeners, if we could summarize, because we started the conversation with infrastructure cost overruns and how to avoid them. What are your top tips in terms of, I guess, cost avoidance on infrastructure projects?
Well, the top one, like I said, phase gate, is without a disciplined phase gate, it's all kind of pointless because no one will ever know where they're at. Once you have a disciplined phase gate system, which people, I think infrastructure now is getting there, they now have, every country basically has one, is that you have to have the risk QRA or risk quantification method that uses that measure of the level of scope definition directly, based on our historical understanding of the uncertainty resulting from the level of scope definition. So that's number 2. Now, on top of that, we have the issue of complexity. That's a whole 5-day conversation in its own right. But complexity is almost as devastating as the level of scope definition, because on these mega projects, the mode of failure is not linear. So on the average large project, you have good and bad, and they're just kind of mediocre, and you got this curve. When you get complexity with all of these parts and pieces of the system, and it's hard to see it all, and they don't work together very well, you can have one part of the system start collapsing, and it can pull down everything and result in a blowout. And so complexity can result in nonlinear behavior. So that's another tool in our toolkit. We can take the models we have and add the nonlinearity component and address the complexity issue. So for infrastructure, that's the third thing, is that there are so many mega projects now in transportation particularly, and now high voltage transmission and other things, that we have to model that complexity and quantify it. And we need to get the complexity topic away from the academics and consultants. They just talk. I'm an engineer.
I agree.
So in my book, I have a method. Anybody can quantify complexity and put a number on it, and enough talk. We know what it looks like. We know how it behaves, and we know that fat tail. And we know the probability that fat tail is going to go up as it gets more complex. What more do you need to know? So anyway, there is a fairly simple methodology for that. So that's the third thing, is complexity. The fourth thing is level of technology. So if you have like a high-speed rail, a maglev or something, now you're really in trouble. Because we know, again, from research, that when you throw new technology in there, that the uncertainty cloud just got that much wider. Because in the course of a mega project that lasts 5 or 6 years, new technology will evolve. It doesn't stand still. So right in the middle of engineering and right in the middle of construction, the guys in the laboratory are white coats are coming up with new stuff. And we see this a lot in the control side. The controls are always evolving, never stop. And so, you see the end of the mega projects, the controls and the signaling systems causing nightmares because 7 years ago, they had another technology.
Yeah.
7 years later, you have this AI-driven control thing that they didn't figure out until 6 months ago. So you have technology issues. All of that has to be addressed. Each one tackled in its own right with specific tools and measurements to do each one. And it's all there. It's not yet invented. It's been done, and we know what it looks like.
That's brilliant. Thanks, John.
Sorry, Val. If anyone saw LinkedIn, I don't know if you saw this, John. We're representing you coming up next on talking about infrastructure, cost overruns, how to avoid them. And someone wrote, "All you need to do is put John on the project." So I thought that was a really good comment.
No, unfortunately, you can see what I'm wearing. People don't listen to me because I don't have the gravitas, and I get kind of passionate about things, so they kind of turn off when I start yelling at them. But
we love it here. We love your passion, John.
But anyway, I now have software available on the cloud, so you don't have to look at me. You just get the license to the software, and everything in the book is now available without talking to me at all.
There we go. There we go. And the software you're talking about, that's ValidRisk, is that correct?
Yeah, we just came out with it last month. I've been implementing the methods for 15 years.
Yeah.
But it was kind of company by company through word of mouth and spreadsheet based. And then last year we decided to take the leap and make it a commercial product. So it's called ValidRisk, all one word, validrisk.com, and it's a license fee based product.
Awesome.
That
and
has parametric modeling in it. It's fully calibratable. So if you're in infrastructure, you can use your own historical experience and calibrate it to the skewness and bias that you have. Bias is actually a main input. There is bias, and that has to be quantified. But anyway, it also deals with risk events. So anyway, it's integrated. It produces a cost and a schedule outcome. You can produce a joint confidence level chart if you like that kind of approach. We're still working on the escalation module. Escalation is another whole topic. I kind of leaped into it in the beginning of the super cycle, so I feel like I'm probably one of the world's experts on it, because at IPA, we had to normalize our data for time to keep it current. And in 2004, we discovered that the indices that were published everywhere were total garbage. And so that was a 6-month learning exercise right there, just to figure out what the heck is going on with escalation. And realize that there are no published indices, not a one, for the price of capital projects. So that maybe we can have another podcast about that.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Methods people are using are, to a large extent, garbage. Using inflation indices, which really have nothing to do with what we do. And the published indices don't match anything that's bid. There is no index for anything that's bid. It's only for things you can buy in a catalog or order consistently from, so which is not the problem. The problem is when you get in a hot market and you have bidding behavior, which an escalation then becomes an order of magnitude different than people's understanding. So anyway, that's another toolkit. So in my toolkit, I use my contingency tools that build up as inputs to the escalation model. So when you get the schedule distribution, that in turn is driving the escalation cash flow. So what you get out of it is a universal capital cost profile. Tendency, escalation, complexity, you name it, it's all in there. I just got to get people to pay attention.
Well, hopefully this is one way, John, the Product Chat podcast.
Hopefully. Yeah.
But we'll certainly post links to the website, to where people can get your books as well, to the show notes, so they can go and grab that. And plus they can get hold of you on LinkedIn as well. You're not hiding anywhere, which is fantastic. I just have one more question heading into the end of the podcast. You spoke quite a bit earlier on around how we need to ensure that we're measuring our scope definition. And I just wonder, for those listening in, going, how do we measure our scope definition? Do you have just a little bit more insight to those listening that might help them?
Yeah, well, first of all, from an estimator's viewpoint, that is the purpose of classification. It is a measurement of the level of scope definition from the viewpoint of an estimator, of what an estimator needs to know and documents they need to be aware of and to study and so forth. But beyond the estimating view, you have other planning documents, assuring, for example, that you're working with the stakeholders and doing stakeholder management. And it tends to be in the form of something like check the box, if you will. Unfortunately, people don't put enough thinking into it. But it's really just a series of studies and deliverables and things you need to know at the decision gate in order to quantify anything. We have to measure it first. Now, when we were at IPA, we criticize things like the Project Definition Rating Index, which is also measuring, because it's a self-performed assessment, and there's a tendency to be biased. And I'm going to give you an example. In the process plant world, all estimators know that the P&IDs, the process and implementation diagram, is king. If that's not complete and signed off by operations, you've got nothing. And as estimators, we know that the P&ID is gospel. So if you have a way of measuring the level of scope definition, what you need to have is a really good qualitative assessment of the state of the P&IDs. What's in it? What's not in it? Have we checked? Is everything done? Have all the studies been done? And you have the same type of deep questioning about every deliverable. So, for example, you just can't say, "Hey, I got a class 3 estimate." I hate that designation, because when I review estimates, which is I do for a living, I have never seen a class 3 estimate in my life. I am not exaggerating. Every estimate a contractor calls class 3 is around class 3.4. What do I mean by that? I mean that every deliverable, when I look at them, is not really done. Oh, we got a P&ID, but we didn't finish the utility P&IDs. We only got the process ID. Well, guys, it doesn't count. you don't have all the PNIDs and they're not signed off by operations, you've got nothing, because operations has the wherewithal to change anything they want until they sign it. So anyway, that's the problem with the level of scope definition, is the check the box mentality and taking credit for things you really haven't finished. So when I apply my risk method, I don't give you credit until you're done. And teams kind of take issue with that. They get mad at me, just, hey, we finished PNID. I said, no, you didn't. Come back to me when you're done. So anyway, that's what I mean by level of scope definition, not just the technical deliverables for the estimate. It also includes things like stakeholder management, regulators, working with them, which is increasingly important, and all of those types of things as well. Communication, getting buy-in, so forth.
Awesome. No, thanks for that, and it's useful tips for those listening in. John, as you mentioned, we'd love to get you back for another podcast because there is so much we can talk about, and we've gone down quite a few rabbit holes, quite deep rabbit holes on this one. You call them tangents, we love to call them rabbit holes, and we're going to find those nuggets, and I think we got a lot of nuggets on the show, so thank you for that. This section of the podcast is the feature, though. It's called Defend the Indefensible. It's inspired by the ridiculous statements we hear day to day. And what we do is we put our guest in the hot seat for 30 seconds to defend a ridiculous statement. So if you're ready and if you're willing, I'll give you a statement and you have 30 seconds to defend it.
I have to defend it?
Yeah, in other words, you have to argue for the statement.
Okay.
So are you ready,
Just remember,
John?
don't cut this snippet out. Anyway. In context, I'm glad to do it.
We will not take out the explanation, so you are okay. So the statement is the following. Risk analysis is academic and a waste of time. We don't need fancy statistics, just deliver to the plan.
Actually, it is a waste of time because all of the estimates we do are so overestimated and fat and larded with allowances and stuff. So we don't really need any contingency to start with. So it is a waste of time. Why do we even bother with contingency? And by the way, off the record, that is true statement for projects, small projects. It is a waste of time for the average 6-month, $500,000 project. So that's, unfortunately, I can defend it as a true statement.
Awesome. And you were almost spot on with 30 seconds, 31 seconds, but that was amazing. Thank you, John, for being such a good sport. A little bit of fun at the end there of the podcast. Heading into the end, John, I want to come to you just for any final thoughts, words of wisdom that you want to leave the listeners with.
Simply to consider joining AACE International if you're not already a member. It was a lifeline for me when I was in my 30s. It's made my career, so to speak. And also not just join AACE, but get involved. Everything I've learned, I learned from developing product. I was not the expert in anything that CCM, that was my education. So the more you're involved and commenting on things, reviewing things, actually developing our products or just writing papers, you're going to learn an awful lot more than taking some, I'm going to say stupid class. Maybe I'm a self-learner, but joining AACE was a fabulous opportunity because it's a small enough organization you can make a difference. You get to know the experts that are there personally, and they are experts, so just really look into becoming active in AACE at your local section or wherever.
Thanks, John. Thank you for that. And I'm sure Val will echo those sentiments because he started his journey with the AACE not too long ago. Val, any final thoughts from you?
No, John. No, I'm actually going to study up and get some reading. I know there's a few books you've got out. Again, I think Total Cost Management, for anyone who hasn't read that, is a great, consolidation of some of the work at AACE, but also yourself, John. And, I've been reading your publications for a while, so thanks for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. again, thank you guys for inviting me. I appreciate it.
It's been our absolute privilege and pleasure, John. Just before we go, John, we promised you a bonus section, which is the Q&A called Tenor. It's a quick fire, 10 questions and 10 answers by yourself, which Val will take you through.
I'm ready when you're ready, John. Ready to go?
Okay.
All right. The first one is, what's your morning routine?
I get up about 5:30. I exercise for half an hour, take a walk for about 20 minutes and eat breakfast. And I'm usually at my computer and writing in LinkedIn before I get down to work.
Excellent. Number 2, would you rather spend your day with people or technology?
I love technology, but I love communicating about it. So unfortunately, I'm probably talking at people more than communicating. But no, I'm an Aspergian person, not so much in public company, but I love technology, but I love sharing a lot.
Question 3, how do you deal with stress?
I don't really have any. I'm 65 and I don't take any prescriptions. I don't know how I got here, but I think I just really kind of fascinated by curiosity, and I've been fortunate in my life to always have a good income and so forth. So I just don't seem to suffer from stress. So I get stressed by stupid remarks, but other than that.
Question 4, what is the best book you've been gifted?
Gifted. Probably the biggest gift, my wife kind of steered me to an online website, Goodreads, that drove me to be more logical in my reading. So it's not just one book. It's more reading cross-section books and reading constantly. And so I would recommend everybody get involved in goodreads.com. Track your reading, read what other people are reading. It's kind of like this book Noise that just came out, keep on top of that type of stuff. So I read probably 40 to 50 books a year. It's a goal, it's something I need to do. Of course, I get old, so I need to do it for other reasons, keep my brain going. But anyway,
yeah,
one book, it's the gift of structured reading, if you will, or thinking about reading.
Excellent. Question 6, what's the best piece of advice you've been given?
Well, my father, who was an executive at U.S. Steel, which at one point was the largest company in the world, told me, you can be loyal to people, but not a company. A company has no soul. And, you asked me about stress. I think that he unfortunately passed away young because of stress and being loyal to a company, doing whatever they want to do. And so I think that's, if I get tired of a place, I leave. So, in terms of a company, I have a contract with them. As long as it's to both of our advantages, well, I'll be big help to you. But as soon as it's not to our mutual advantage, I'm going to move up down the road to something more interesting, So that's kept my stress level down by finding interesting opportunities and challenges and moving. The only thing I'm loyal to are, the mentors and my family and so forth.
Brilliant. Question 7, what is the biggest mistake you've made on a project?
Overstepping my knowledge, imposter syndrome it's a problem with consulting. It's an ethical question, as people looking at you. It's funny when you're 50, you become a consultant, all of a sudden these executives who didn't pay the time of day, all of a sudden are staring at you. And what do you think? So there's this pressure to kind of overstep your level of knowledge and sometimes maybe lead them a little astray. Not necessarily intentional, it's just probably really didn't have any business making recommendation. I'm not going to give any specific example, but I've given bad advice here and there that turned out 3 years later that, why in the world did I say that, But that's the thing. It just makes sure you stay within your area of expertise, always expanding that area. Somehow you push the boundary, but it can get dicey if you push too far.
Question 9. What profession other than your own would you have liked to have attempted?
I'll say it again, other than what?
What profession other than your own would you like to have attempted?
I wonder if I should have been a scientist. I went into engineering. My dad was an engineer, and this seemed like I was an engineer for life. So maybe I'll tell my 10-year-old self, don't just focus on engineering. But, science, I might have been a better fit there than in engineering. But who knows?
Brilliant. And the final one, if you had $1 million in a day, what would you spend it on?
That's the problem is I probably wouldn't spend it on anything. I hate to say, when you get to this age, the hockey stick starts to pick up. You have $1 million, you don't spend it. You're kind of asking yourself that question every day. Why don't I spend this damn money? But unfortunately, I'd probably put it in the bank. And that's why I don't have any stress.
Well done. Well said, John. Thank you for being such a good candidate for our Tenor session. Over to you, Dale.
Thank you, Val. And thank you, John. That was pretty cool just to have a bit of fun at the end there as well.
I want to say one more thing. I want to do a shout out. It's kind of like the Carol Burnett thing.
Yeah, go for it.
Remember, she used to pull her ear. So somebody out there listening to me right now, pulling my ear. My mentor, want to give recognition to Bruce Elliott, who's saved my rear end more than a few times. So thanks, Bruce. So that's it.
Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you, Bruce. If not for you, Bruce, we wouldn't have John here today and all the good things he has done for the community. So thank you, Bruce, so much. So folks, that is all we have time for on this episode, but it doesn't have to stop here. Support our charities, access blogs, or if you think you have something interesting to share, visit projectchatterpodcast.com. Don't forget you can send us a voice message via our Anchor page as well. And don't forget to hit subscribe on our YouTube channel and your favorite podcast player so you don't miss the next one. A big thank you to our guest, John Hollmann, and thank you all for listening. Till next time, we say stay safe, be disruptive, and have fun doing it. From me and Val, it's bye for now.